In December of 1941, as Pearl Harbor burned, an American pilot in the Philippines faced an impossible choice: abandon his family to fight or desert to protect them. Paul "Pappy Gunn chose both. At 42 years old, this naval aviation veteran would transform bombers into flying machine guns. He would also orchestrate one of the most audacious family rescue campaigns of World War II. His wife, Polly, and their 4 children were trapped in Japanese-occupied territory. However, Pappy would discover that the war had turned his own children into guerrillas. This is the story of how one man reinvented air warfare in the Pacific, while his children fought a secret war in the Philippine jungles. It's also about how a family, separated by war, became a unified military force that the Japanese could never break. The Japanese attack on the Philippines began just hours after Pearl Harbor. However, for Pappy Gunn, the war became personal the moment enemy bombers appeared over Manila. As a civilian pilot for Philippine Airlines, he knew every landing strip, every mountain, and every bay in the archipelago. When American forces began to withdraw to Bataan, Pappy faced an agonizing decision. His family was in Manila, but his piloting experience was desperately needed to evacuate military personnel. He made the choice that would define the rest of the war. He flew to Australia with a promise to return. As his plane disappeared over the southern horizon, Pappy Gunn and their children, Nathaniel, Paul Jr., Connie, and Julie, prepared for 3.5 years of Japanese occupation. None of them knew that this separation would forge one of the deadliest family alliances in the Pacific theater. In Australia, Pappy Gunn immediately enlisted in the Army Air Force. However, his age kept him away from fighter planes. Instead, he was assigned to modify aircraft, a task he would transform into a lethal art. His first experiments involved installing additional .50 caliber machine guns on A-20 Havoc bombers, but soon he focused his attention on the B-25 Mitchell. The medium bomber was effective against ground targets, but Pappy envisioned something revolutionary, transforming it into a direct attack platform capable of destroying Japanese ships at sea level. Working 18 hours a day in improvised hangars, he began removing the bomb bays and installing frontal machine gun batteries. Each modification was tested on flights he piloted himself, ignoring regulations and military hierarchy. His superiors initially resisted, but the results were undeniable. His strafers were creating a new form of air warfare. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, Pappy's family faced the brutality of Japanese occupation in Manila. Polly and the children were initially confined to their home, but in January of 1942, they were transferred to the Santo Tomas internment camp. Conditions were deplorable: watery rice rations, extreme overcrowding, and constant disease. However, Pappy's children, especially 16-year-old Nathaniel and 14-year-old Paul Jr., quickly adapted. They established contacts with Filipino guerrillas operating around Manila, passing information about Japanese troop movements and helping to smuggle supplies into the camp. What began as small acts of resistance evolved into a sophisticated intelligence network. The Japanese never suspected that American children were coordinating sabotage operations just a few miles from their headquarters. In March of 1942, Pappy completed his first revolutionary modification: a B-25 equipped with 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, capable of firing 4,800 rounds per minute. The combat test came during an attack against Japanese ships in Rabaul Harbor. Flying at just 50 feet above the water, Pappy and his crew opened fire on an enemy destroyer. The result was devastating. The concentrated fire pierced the ship's hull like paper. Within minutes, the destroyer was sinking. The tactic of skip bombing, skipping bombs across the water's surface like stones, combined with massive frontal firepower, created a weapon the Japanese could not effectively counter. Pappy had invented what would become known as a gunship, decades before the term was coined. His strafers began terrorizing Japanese shipping throughout the South Pacific. Back in the Philippines, Pappy's children were developing their own innovative tactics. Nathaniel had become an expert in improvised explosives, using smuggled materials to sabotage Japanese equipment. Paul Jr. coordinated a network of messengers who transmitted intelligence through Manila. The girls, Connie and Julie, despite being younger, served as observers, memorizing Japanese patrol patterns and identifying vulnerable targets. Polly, initially reluctant to involve the children, realized that resistance was their only chance for psychological survival. The family developed elaborate codes based on children's songs and games to communicate sensitive information. When Japanese guards heard the Gunn children singing lullabies, they were actually transmitting details about troop movements and supply schedules to the Filipino resistance. In June of 1942, Pappy received his first promotion to major. However, official recognition meant less to him than every intelligence report about the Philippines. He had established contacts with clandestine radio operators who occasionally transmitted information about internment camps. Every fragment of news about Santo Tomas was obsessively analyzed. When he learned that his family was alive but in deteriorating conditions, Pappy intensified his efforts to accelerate the reconquest of the Philippines. He began training exiled Filipino pilots in his aircraft modification techniques, creating a guerrilla air force that could operate from improvised airstrips. His modified B-25s were now equipped with up to 14 machine guns, transforming each aircraft into a flying fortress capable of destroying entire convoys. The war had become a race against time to reconquer the Philippines before his family succumbed to the camp's conditions. The year 1943 brought dramatic developments on both sides of the Pacific. Pappy had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and now commanded an entire squadron of modified strafers. His tactics were being copied by other units, but no one could match his lethal precision. In a single mission over Wewak Harbor, his bombers destroyed 12 Japanese ships in 15 minutes. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the resistance network coordinated by Pappy's children had expanded to include dozens of prisoners and Filipino collaborators. They were now providing regular intelligence to guerrillas operating in the mountains of Luzon. Nathaniel had become so skilled in sabotage that the Japanese offered a reward for his capture, unaware that he was an American teenager. The war was transforming the Gunn family into a distributed, yet lethal military unit. In September of 1943, Pappy received the news he had feared. Conditions in Santo Tomas were rapidly deteriorating. Clandestine reports indicated that prisoners were dying of malnutrition and disease. The mortality rate had tripled in the last 6 months. Pappy knew that time was running out. He began pressuring his superiors to accelerate invasion plans for the Philippines, arguing that his strafers could neutralize Japanese air defenses in a matter of weeks. When he encountered bureaucratic resistance, Pappy made a characteristic decision. He began planning unauthorized reconnaissance missions over the Philippines. Flying alone in modified B-25s, he mapped Japanese defenses and established radio contact with guerrillas. These suicidal missions provided crucial intelligence for invasion planning. They also revealed to Pappy the extent of Japanese brutality against civilians. October of 1943 marked a turning point in the Gunn family's secret war. Nathaniel, now 17 years old, had orchestrated the sabotage of a Japanese ammunition depot that resulted in an explosion visible for miles. The retaliation was swift and brutal. The Japanese implemented collective punishments in the camp, further reducing already scarce rations. But instead of breaking the prisoners' morale, the repression intensified the resistance. Pappy Gunn emerged as a natural leader among the interned women, organizing support systems that kept sick prisoners alive through improvised medical care and food sharing. She had learned to make medicines from local plants smuggled in by her children. The family was now operating as a complete resistance cell. Intelligence, sabotage, medical care, and morale. The Japanese controlled the camp physically, but the Gunns controlled its spirit. In December of 1943, Pappy reached the peak of his military innovation with the creation of the Super Strafer, a B-25 equipped with 1650 caliber machine guns and two 75mm cannons. The aircraft was essentially a flying cruiser, capable of engaging Japanese warships in direct combat. The combat test came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where Pappy led a formation of strafers against a Japanese fleet attempting to reinforce Rabaul. In one of the most devastating aerial actions of the war, the strafers sank 8 transport ships and 2 destroyers in a single pass. The concentration of fire was so intense that Japanese survivors reported seeing fire-breathing dragons emerging from the clouds. Pappy had created a weapon that fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Each victory brought him closer to his family, but also intensified his urgency. He knew the Japanese could execute prisoners if they felt cornered. Early 1944 brought contradictory news for Pappy. Intelligence reports indicated that MacArthur was finally planning the return to the Philippines. However, they also revealed that the Japanese were preparing the final solution for internment camps, mass execution of Allied prisoners. Pappy intensified his unauthorized reconnaissance flights, now flying weekly missions over Luzon. During one of these flights, he managed to establish direct radio contact with the resistance network, coordinated by his children. The conversation lasted only 3 minutes. However, it was enough to confirm that the entire family was alive and active in the resistance. Nathaniel had become a demolitions expert. Paul Jr. coordinated intelligence for 3 provinces. The girls served as messengers for a network that now included hundreds of collaborators. Polly was keeping dozens of sick prisoners alive through improvised medicine. The family was not just surviving, they were thriving as a military force. In March of 1944, Pappy's Strafers participated in the largest aerial operation of the war in the Pacific up to that point, the attack on Hollandia. More than 200 aircraft participated, but Pappy's modified B-25s were the protagonists. In 3 days of continuous combat, they destroyed 340 Japanese aircraft on the ground and sank 15 ships in the harbor. The lethal precision of the Strafers was now legendary among Allied pilots and feared by the Japanese. Pappy had developed tactics that allowed coordinated attacks from multiple directions, creating crossfire fields that made it impossible for ground targets to escape. Each mission was planned with surgical precision, but executed with savage ferocity. The Japanese began evacuating important installations whenever Strafers were detected in the area. Pappy was literally terrorizing the enemy out of strategic positions, accelerating the timetable for the reconquest of the Philippines. April of 1944 marked the 3rd anniversary of the Gunn family's separation. It also brought the first concrete signs that liberation was near. B-29 bombers began appearing over the Philippines, and the resistance network coordinated by Pappy's children received instructions to intensify sabotage operations. Nathaniel led a coordinated attack against 3 railway bridges that paralyzed Japanese transport in Luzon for 2 weeks. Paul Jr. established direct contact with American submarines, coordinating the landing of weapons and supplies for guerrillas. The operations were becoming so sophisticated that the Japanese suspected infiltration by trained Allied commandos, never imagining that American teenagers were orchestrating the campaign. Polly had transformed a section of the camp into a clandestine hospital, saving lives through surgeries performed with improvised instruments. The family was now operating as an elite military unit distributed across the Philippines. In June of 1944, Pappy received official orders he had waited 3 years for: prepare his Strafers to support the invasion of the Philippines. MacArthur had finally approved Operation King II, and Pappy's modified B-25s would be crucial to neutralize Japanese coastal defenses. Pappy immediately began training pilots in close air support tactics, developing techniques to attack bunkers and artillery positions without hitting Allied troops. His Strafers were equipped with new sighting systems that allowed unprecedented precision in low-altitude attacks. Each aircraft now carried 3,000 machine gun rounds and 12 fragmentation bombs, transforming them into mobile destruction platforms. Pappy knew that this would be his last chance to save his family. If the invasion failed, the Japanese would execute all Allied prisoners. The pressure was overwhelming, but also liberating. Finally, he could channel 3 years of rage and despair into direct military action. July of 1944 brought confirmation that the invasion of the Philippines would begin in October. Pappy intensified his preparations. However, he also received disturbing news. The resistance network coordinated by his children had been partially discovered by the Japanese. Nathaniel and Paul Jr. were forced to hide in the mountains, while Polly and the girls faced intensive interrogations in the camp. For 2 weeks, Pappy had no news of his family, fearing the worst. When contact was finally re-established, he discovered that his children had not only escaped capture, but used the Japanese pursuit to lure enemy troops into guerrilla ambushes. In an operation that lasted 3 days, they helped eliminate an entire company of Japanese soldiers. Polly had resisted interrogations without revealing information, protecting dozens of collaborators. The family was now officially wanted by the Japanese. However, they had also become a legend among Filipino guerrillas. August of 1944 was the most intense month of the war for Pappy. His strafers were flying daily preparation missions for the invasion, systematically destroying Japanese infrastructure in the Philippines. In a single week, they sank 23 ships, destroyed 45 aircraft, and eliminated 12 coastal artillery positions. Pappy was personally leading 2 missions a day, ignoring medical orders to rest. His obsession with his family's liberation had become legendary among his crew, who followed him on increasingly dangerous missions without questioning. During an attack on Manila Harbor, Pappy flew so low that his aircraft was hit by fragments from his own bombs. He completed the mission with the right engine on fire, landing on an emergency airstrip with enough fuel for only 2 minutes of flight. His men knew they were flying with a pilot who had transcended fear, and that made them invincible. September of 1944 marked the final preparations for the invasion. However, it also brought the most terrifying news of the war for Pappy. The Japanese had discovered his children's identity and issued execution orders. Nathaniel and Paul Jr. were now officially classified as enemy terrorists, with 10,000 peso bounties on their heads. Polly and the girls were transferred to a high-security section of the camp, where prisoners were regularly executed. Pappy knew he had weeks, perhaps days, before his family would be killed. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He requested permission to lead the first wave of air attacks over Manila, arguing that his strafers could neutralize defenses before the main landing. When permission was denied due to the risks, Pappy began planning an unauthorized mission that would violate all military rules, but could save his family. On October 12, 1944, Pappy Gunn took off on his most important mission, to lead 18 strafers in a coordinated attack against Manila's defenses, 3 days before the official invasion. The mission was technically insubordination that could result in a court-martial. However, Pappy had convinced his crew that it was necessary for the invasion's success. Flying at 50 feet over Manila Bay, the strafers opened fire on Japanese coastal positions with a ferocity that surprised even war veterans. In 45 minutes, they destroyed 23 bunkers, sank 8 ships, and eliminated 2 artillery batteries that could have devastated the landing troops. But Pappy's true objective was different. During the attack, he flew directly over Santo Tomas, transmitting a radio message in code that his family would recognize. The message was simple: "Daddy's coming home." Liberation was just 72 hours away. The invasion of Leyte began on October 20th, 1944. However, Pappy was focused on Manila, where his family remained prisoners. His strafers provided devastating air support for the landing troops, but each mission was planned to bring him closer to Luzon. In 3 weeks of intense combat, Pappy's modified B-25s destroyed more Japanese equipment than any other air unit in the Pacific War. They had developed tactics so effective that Japanese commanders began evacuating positions whenever strafers were detected. Meanwhile, Nathaniel and Paul Jr. were coordinating guerrilla attacks that facilitated the American advance, providing real-time intelligence on enemy positions. The Gunn family was now fighting the same war from opposite sides of the front lines, each member contributing to the Japanese defeat. The reunion was near, but Pappy knew that the most dangerous moments were still to come. In December of 1944, American forces were approaching Manila. However, Pappy received terrifying intelligence. The Japanese were planning to execute all Santo Tomas prisoners before evacuating the city. He had perhaps a week before his family would be killed. Pappy made the riskiest decision of his military career. He would lead a direct attack on the internment camp, violating direct orders to wait for ground troops. On January 3, 1945, he took off with 6 strafers on a mission that was essentially military suicide. Flying at 30 feet over Santo Tomas, The B-25s opened fire on Japanese guard towers with surgical precision, carefully avoiding the prisoner barracks. The action lasted only 8 minutes, but it eliminated 47 Japanese guards and destroyed the camp's defenses. When Pappy flew over the camp one last time, he saw prisoners waving from the barracks, including 4 figures he instantly recognized as his family. The liberation of Santo Tomas came on February 3, 1945, when troops from the 1st Cavalry Division stormed the camp. Pappy was flying air cover when he saw American soldiers marching through the gates. He landed on a nearby airstrip and rushed to the camp, arriving just hours after the liberation. What he found changed his perspective on the war forever. Polly had lost 40 pounds, but she was alive and caring for sick prisoners. Nathaniel and Paul Jr., now young adults hardened by war, had become respected leaders among Filipino guerrillas. Connie and Julie, though malnourished, maintained the indomitable spirit Pappy remembered. But the reunion was bittersweet. The family had survived, but 3 years and 4 months of separation had transformed them into strangers. They would need to learn to be a family again, but first, they had a war to finish. In the final months of the war, the Gunn family operated as a unified military unit for the first time. Pappy continued leading Strafer missions, but now with Nathaniel serving as a ground intelligence expert and Paul Jr. coordinating guerrilla operations. Polly established field hospitals for Filipino civilians, while Connie and Julie served as translators and messengers. Together, they participated in the liberation of Luzon, each member contributing skills developed during years of separation. Pappy discovered that his children had become more experienced soldiers than many veterans, with intimate knowledge of the terrain and Japanese tactics. The war had stolen their childhood, but it had also transformed them into a formidable military force. In August of 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Gunn family had participated in more combat operations than any other American family in World War II. The post-war period brought official recognition for Pappy Gunn's contributions. He was promoted to colonel and received the Distinguished Service Cross for his innovations in aircraft modification. His Strafers had sunk more than 200 Japanese ships and destroyed hundreds of aircraft, fundamentally changing the nature of air warfare in the Pacific. But for Pappy, the true victory was having his family reunited. Nathaniel and Paul Jr. received commendations for their resistance activities, becoming some of the youngest recipients of military medals in American history. Polly was recognized for her medical contributions in the internment camps, saving dozens of lives through improvised care. The family decided to remain in the Philippines, where they had found a second home among the people who had helped them survive. They had started the war as an ordinary American family, and ended as a Filipino military legend. Pappy Gunn died in 1957, but his legacy transcended his military innovations. He had proven that individual determination could change the course of a world war, and that family love could survive the most extreme horrors. His aircraft modifications influenced the development of modern gunships, including the AC-130 Spectre used decades later in Vietnam. More importantly, he demonstrated that war does not have to destroy families. It can strengthen them. Nathaniel and Paul Jr. became aeronautical engineers, continuing their father's innovation work. Polly established medical schools in the Philippines, training a generation of healthcare professionals. The daughters became educators, teaching Filipino-American history. The family that had been separated by war became a unifying force in peace, building bridges between cultures and nations that endure to this day.